On Mondays, we like to check in with the Australian Christian Lobby on the week's political agenda. And Rob Norman, the ACL State Director in the state of Queensland, joining us. Hey, Rob, welcome back to 2020.
Neil, always good to catch up with you, mate, particularly after a busy weekend.
Hey, Rob, what have you been doing with yourself? I mean, you're the State Director for the state of Queensland. You know, people might be wondering, you know, you're a lobbyist. There's state directors for the ACL in all the different states and territories. What is it that's filling your week? Can we start off just with a little bit of something personal on your work schedule and the sorts of things that you've got as at the heart of what you do?
Yeah, look, a lot of people think that there's a bit of a lull before the election, Neil, and things go quiet in Parliament, but it's actually the reverse. I've actually attended 5 parliamentary inquiries this year, so that's taken a fair bit of time up. We're going to have another one in August for the live births inquiry. So that kind of takes a fair bit of time. It means I'm wearing a well-worn route to Parliament House, Neil, and apart from that, we have 50,000 grassroots members, so there's always something to do.
And, you know, when you've got this well-worn trail between your home base and Parliament House, it means you're becoming better known too in the corridors of power. And no doubt, as you're wandering the corridors in the Queensland Parliament, people are starting to get to know you quite well.
No, that's right. I think some people run the other way when they see me come into Parliament. I hope that's not the case, though. I think many good relationships have been formed, and really that's the essence of lobbying, Neil. If you want to be a part of change for the future, it's really important to get to know politicians, know how they tick, encourage them, and from time to time bring some warnings, I guess, on consequences of some of the bills they try to introduce.
In fact, the longer you're in the role, the more influential you become, because trust is an issue, isn't it? And people get to know you. Trust grows, and then they'll value your insights and the way you bring a different dimension to the sorts of values that are going along in those political conversations and those decisions that our states around Australia are making. Hey, let's start on some of the things that are going on, things that you're working on. A bill that would ensure all babies born alive are given best practice care, including babies born alive after abortions. This is something that is quite alive in the state of Queensland. Yeah,
that's right. This bill began as a conversation really late last year, and Robbie Katter, the leader of the KAP, the Katter Party, has introduced the bill. There will be a parliamentary inquiry on August the 19th, and then hopefully the bill will be voted on before the election. So there are 2 sitting weeks directly after that inquiry. It's a reasonably tight agenda, Neil, but the bottom line is this is a human rights bill, so it's a bill that will protect all babies and give all babies born alive the same equal rights, whether they were born as wanted children or whether they are the result of a botched abortion. And unfortunately, people don't even believe that is the case, but the stats in Queensland are shocking. We see almost 1 baby born every week alive as a result of a botched abortion.
Rob, is this one of those issues when you were sharing what happens when you're in the corridors of the state parliament and you notice that, you know, there are some members that might ordinarily come up and say hi, but they're sort of pretending that they didn't notice you were there because of issues like this? Because sometimes when I guess you're a parliamentarian and you've got a conscience and you recognise what has to be done, the right thing to do, but maybe your party's policies don't align with this biblical model that these babies are valuable. Is this one of those ones that, you know, it's sometimes difficult to have those conversations with our political leaders?
Yeah, it certainly is, Neil. Look, it dials up all sorts of denial in people. Matters would even happen. And those that are on the so-called pro-choice side of the argument, they really believe that they're simply, when there's an abortion, that babies are simply terminated, that progress is terminated as if it was some kind of computer program or something like that. But none of these issues go simply, Neil. And when there's life involved, and we interfere with it, there are always consequences.
When you get into those conversations with politicians, or it might be their political staffers, or the people that you connect with, when you're into those conversations, is there any sort of leeway? Is there something that's happening that might bend the thoughts that one might have if they're just doing their job, going along with the party line? Is there something that you can sometimes notice? You know, the light switch was just switched on. They realise something now a little deeper than they did before. Do you come across those moments?
Most absolutely, Neil, absolutely. Look, with this particular bill, I had a conversation with an MP that I'm not going to name, but it was a male. So he basically, when I talked to him about this issue, he was visibly moved. And I think that's true of anything where there is a life issue, you know, where it goes close to home. But when he heard about the process and what's happening with babies that are born alive after an abortion, he was moved. Look, I believe that God is involved in that as well. You and I probably are on a unity ticket there, Neil, that the Holy Spirit goes before us, and I certainly rely on that. I try to be led by where God takes me into Parliament. I also rely very heavily on the prayers of those around me, particularly our supporters, wife and family and so forth, and people like you. But look, we go into that situation, we rely on God to go before us, and He very, very often does.
And you know, you should be encouraged, Rob, because when you're in those conversations, and you're doing so as the delegate, the state leader for Australian Christian Lobby, but you know, there'll be listeners who are listening to our conversation now, and who knows how many tens of thousands there will be across Australia, and they're all with you in that, and they're all alongside you, and they're all cheering from the sideline and saying, hey Rob, get in there and represent us, you're doing a great job. Hey, just before we move on from this, because you know, pro-life issues are things we often talk about when we're doing an update on political agendas with the Australian Christian Lobby. You'll be familiar with what's going on in the overseas context, that debate, that circus, the campaign that's going on with the US election, and the risk there is, of course, of what's happening in the US drowning out even our opportunity to talk about things in Australia. But clearly, in the US election debate, there is a pro-life and pro-choice or pro-abortion divide amongst two sides there. Does this matter to you when you're in the conversations you're having here in Australia? What's happening overseas? You know, will the next President of the United States and their stance on abortion affect the way that political leaders here also talk about abortion? How do you reflect on the effects that come from even way outside of our nation?
Yeah, look, that's a great question. There is always absolutely a downstream effect from American politics. We're always on the receiving end of that in one way or another, and obviously President Trump has a very former President Trump has a very pro-life stance when it comes to abortion, and that has become an election issue. So with now the demise of President Biden and his pulling out of the race, we know that Kamala Harris definitely takes that pro-choice or pro-abortion stance as well. So this is a live issue. It definitely will have effect. Roe v. Wade had an effect, and it gives us traction. It gives us the capacity to argue that point, and it's important that we do that. So we're not being contentious, but these are points that need to be raised, and it certainly raises the whole profile of the pro-life agenda, Neil. And so, yes, there always is an effect. American politics, you know, they are the leader of the free world. That's just the way this thing goes, and so it'll always have a flow-on effect with Australian politics as well.
And of course, our abortion laws in Australia are worse than what's in the United States. Just for context for listeners as to where you might be thinking about where Australians are in a pro-life, pro-abortion debate. Hey, let's move on. There's other things you're dealing with in your state of Queensland, Rob. The Respect at Work and Other Matters Amendment Bill. What does all that mean? What's all this about anti-discrimination?
Yeah, so this bill, Neil, it's again, and it happens often, it's almost a Trojan horse. So the bill seems benign when you look at the title of it. It really refers to, it's a union-initiated bill, but it also picks up the failed anti-discrimination bill, a draft that was put up by the Department of Justice and the Attorney General. Now, this bill, I think I mentioned to you last time we spoke, it was a bill that took aim at Christian schools and basically had a Section 25 exemption. So there is an exemption in the existing Act that allows Christian schools to, quote, discriminate, end quote, on the grounds of faith when it comes to hiring staff. Now, there was such a pushback on that, and thanks to our supporters and your listeners and people around the state who really pushed back on it, that the Queensland government rarely, and they rarely do this, but they pulled back on it and allowed Section 25 exemptions to go through. But this Work Respect Bill has bolstered the Anti-Discrimination Act to really discriminate against the church. And I say that without hesitation. So this is churches, institutions, schools, and even Christian individuals and employers. It's a bill, Neil, that will affect free speech and the freedom of expression of religion as well. So it's a very serious bill that seems to be sneaking through.
A few more details on some of those issues that are obvious with this bill, because we're all encouraged that when that news came through that the Queensland government had pulled back and there was speculation, perhaps so they didn't want to pick a fight with Christians in the lead up to a state election. But I suspect that having released their first bill, that was picking the fight, to come back a little bit, but because there's still all sorts of issues with this one. What are the primary things with this new bill that you're concerned about?
Well, yeah, again, good question. There are at least 4 or 5 really tough areas that this bill starts to change. So it introduces a protected attribute into the Act called sexual orientation. And this is really a fundamental change in the way we look at discrimination, anti-discrimination. So it basically pits sexual behaviour on the basis of sexual orientation against religious views. And it will mean that as a protected attribute, those people that practice various things that are in stark contrast to the Christian faith and to what we believe, they will no longer, we will be at risk of being dragged before anti-discrimination courts for speaking out against certain sexual behaviour. Now, this will affect churches. It'll affect the definition of marriage. For instance, if a pastor stands up on Sunday morning and says that marriage is the union of a man and a woman to the exclusion of all others entered into for life, he or she risks being dragged before an anti-discrimination tribunal for having offended someone who doesn't believe that. That's how ridiculous this bill is, Neil. It flows into schools, it flows into other religious institutions.
Yes, even this thought, and as crazy as it sounds, that we might just quote a biblical passage or stand for a biblical value, and those are seen by opposition people to be fighting words and can cause you to be dragged before the courts. That seriously is the way that it works, and people who are vulnerable to that would be church leaders, department leaders, even within your church. Anyone who might be leading a marriage group, just a marriage group within a church. Those sorts of people would be very, very vulnerable to that. Anything else to add? Yep.
Well, just a simple reading of Romans 1, a plain reading of the text. Theoretically, you would be breaching that law. So I went to the inquiry that was held for this, Neil, and I asked those questions before the MPs, and they did not have any answers. So there are typically 6 or 7 MPs in the inquiries. They did not have answers. This is a serious bill. We're running a campaign against it. I would encourage your listeners to jump on the ACL website, look for the blog that relates to this bill, and contact your MP, because many of the MPs don't realise the implications of the bill. That's part of the problem. And so, hate speech, the incitement clauses, all those things are so loosely defined, Neil, that all Christians risk prosecution if this bill is introduced.
And it's interesting that while I was talking about what happens in church, this goes a whole lot deeper. This is a Christian that works in any workplace. These sorts of placings that we have as Christian believers. This is our societal opportunity to be salt and light, and puts you on the line, even puts you into a vulnerable position where you can be dragged into court because you're holding on to a Christian value. And of course, just quickly on this, because there's a temptation then to go light on what your Christian values are. But I suspect the best way to actually make a impact is to actually be strong on your Christian values and to stand for what those Christian values are, even though there may be consequences.
Absolutely. Look, this has always been the way, Neil. I think the way this thing works out, and I've been a pastor for 27 years, if we all band together, we must do that. We must be prepared to speak out. And if we don't do that, then this kind of legislation just keeps increasing. You've got the situation of an employee leaving a book in the lunchroom that highlights Christian marriage or any other area that we hold dearly. He or she could simply be prosecuted for doing that, for actually leaving something that incites hatred, because that term is so loosely defined within this act. So this really it's the most repressive form of anti-discrimination legislation that we've seen in any Australian jurisdiction. So if it's passed, part of my job will be to ask the incoming government, whether it be the LNP or the Labor Party, to repeal the legislation. And we know that that's almost impossible to do. So it's important we hit it up front, Neil, and make sure that we don't pull back or shy away from it.
So even these things you're highlighting today, they're a part of the softened approach that the Queensland government is bringing to these things, and no doubt listeners can hear and read between the lines that this is still a very oppressive position that the Miles government is taking so far as these issues. Hey, just quickly, time's short. There's another bill in Queensland, the Assisted Reproductive Technology Bill. What is this one all about?
Yeah, Neil, these bills rip through Parliament, so I'm constantly on the lookout for whenever there's a new bill come in, and we always try to read between the lines. There is some good points to the bill, so it basically seeks to bring some regulations to assisted reproductive technology, or IVF. That's a good thing because we know there's been breaches, there's been disposal of embryos taking place without regulation. So it does seek to look after that, but there are consequences that come with it. And so the ACL position is that ART, or assisted reproductive technology, really should be reserved for married couples in relationships where they are unable to have children. The other consequences relate to disposal of embryos. Unfortunately, that happens. Now, these are human beings in embryonic form that are being disposed of willy-nilly. So we're obviously against that. We also believe that all children deserve the right to have their natural parents. And whenever a bill like this comes in, it introduces complications, and you've got the commercialisation of donors and so forth. So it's another big bill. It's just something we have to speak out against as well, Neil, and it feeds into that pro-life narrative that all life is sacred and should be treated sacrosanct.
And as you say, these things are significant, and really it's confronting sometimes to be talking about IVF and putting a pro-life lens across IVF. Sometimes we take things for granted. Sometimes there are things that play on our compassion, and somehow or other there's got to be some level of objective truth in there, and highlighting that objective truth doesn't do away with your compassion for people, but it certainly needs to be made, especially when governments are making legislation around issues that affect life. Rob Norman is our guest. He's the Australian Christian Lobby State Director for the state of Queensland. To connect with Rob, and he did mention there's some campaigns that are running, you might want to check those out. And your opportunity from wherever you are today, whether you're at home, whether you're at work, You might want to stop when you're driving and maybe take some action, but you can take some action today, and your action may be especially important around these sorts of bills, and especially as we've been talking about those issues that are going on in the state of Queensland. acl.org.au, the Australian Christian Lobby, acl.org.au, and no doubt there are campaigns for other states and territories that are going on around the nation as well. Rob Norman, the ACL State Director for Queensland. Rob, thanks so much for sharing these thoughts with us today on 2020.
Thanks, Neil. Love coming on the 2020 and always appreciate it. Thanks, mate.